My name is Jonathan Gross, and I'm a January 6th attorney. And to my knowledge, there are no Black Lives Matter attorneys or Antifa attorneys who are defending peaceful protesters. But if the government was arresting peaceful protesters for Black Lives Matter, I would be a Black Lives Matter attorney. I want to be brief and just mention three issues that the American people should know about that are occurring to January 6th defendants that could happen to any American. And that is why January 6th is so important, because it really brings to light some of the problems with our justice system. The first one I want to bring up is that the process is the punishment. The worst example of how the process can destroy a person is the story of 18 USC 1512 C2. It's a statute that imposes a 20-year sentence in prison for, quote, obstructing an official proceeding, whatever that means. This law gave the DOJ the power to charge misdemeanor conduct as a felony that carries with it a punishment of 20 years in jail. One of my clients, an honorably discharged military veteran with a wife and children, never committed a crime in his life, did not enter the Capitol on January 6th, did nothing that would rise to a misdemeanor at worst or above. He was charged with the 1512, convicted by a DC jury, sentenced to 33 months in prison. 3.5 years after January 6th, the Supreme Court held that the 1512 indictments were invalid. So whoops, sorry about that. This man will never get back what was taken from him. He lost his freedom, he lost his job, he lost his money, he lost his reputation. Nobody will compensate him for that lost time. It can never be given back to him. Nobody can compensate him for the indignity of being a prisoner when you're an innocent man. The havoc that it wreaked on his family, the toll it took on his health, his physical health and his psychological health, if you can imagine, the missed celebrations, the holidays, the funerals, what was taken from him will never be returned. And that is how the process, even if you come out innocent, the other side is the punishment. The second point I want to bring up is the catch-all charges. The 1512 charge was only one of several of the charges that are so broad that they can literally apply to anyone. Hundreds of January 6ers are charged and were charged with 18 USC 231A3, what's called the civil disorder charge, a felony punishable up to 5 years in prison. Now, this is what the statute is. Any act that obstructs, impedes, or interferes with law enforcement during a civil disorder. So that's any act, including the mere presence outside the Capitol, basically can be classified as a felony punishable with 5 years. If the cop says that, well, he did, interfered with me, that's 5 years felony. In 1987, there was a Supreme Court case called City of Houston v. Hill. In that case, strikingly, there was an almost identical law. It was a local ordinance in Houston, and a gay rights activist was arrested for violating that local ordinance, which made it unlawful to, in any manner, oppose, molest, abuse, or interrupt a police officer who's performing his duty. So that case, he was arrested and convicted of it, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that's totally unconstitutional. And in the words of Justice Brennan, quote, the ordinance is violated scores of times daily, but only those individuals chosen by the police in their unguided discretion are arrested. So I and others brought this case, Houston v. Hill, to the attention of the DC District Court and argued that, hey, checkmate, right? It's the same law. So they said, no, it's different, because that law said to oppose, molest, abuse, or interrupt the police. But this law says to obstruct, interfere, or what's the third one? Or impede a police officer. See the difference? Totally different. But so yeah, motion denied. But it doesn't matter, because they're missing the point. The point that the Supreme Court was making is that both of these laws are so broad that law enforcement can charge everyone or nobody with it. So the DOJ has the unguided discretion to essentially make anyone a felon. It's very hard sometimes to even distinguish why a J6 or sometimes just the misdemeanor, sometimes the felony. It seems almost random. And I will mention that typically it's based on their social media tweets, and that's going to be most of the evidence in court is a battle of the tweets, and the government is going to cherry pick from thousands of tweets and show I could tell stories. But that brings to the third point. The third point is prosecutors in this country have absolute discretion. I and other January 6 attorneys have filed many motions asking the courts to dismiss charges based on selective prosecution. But the judges have denied every one of those motions. The law in this country, as it stands, is that prosecutors have absolute discretion to prosecute or not prosecute whomever they want. And that simply cannot be the law in a free country. So we have obvious problems that affect all Americans, and the process is the punishment. We have these vague criminal statutes, and prosecutors have absolute discretion and basically no accountability. So how do we get out of this? Or more specifically, what can Congress do to fix these problems? One thing is to start repealing the thousands of overbroad federal criminal statutes. But I realize that obviously takes a lot of time and is not so simple. But the fact there's a book by a former prosecutor called 3 Felonies a Day, that you don't have to buy the book. That's what it is. We're all guilty of 3 felonies a day. It's just a question of whether they find those felonies. There's a J6 attorney, a great J6 attorney named Carol Stewart. She recommends a strategy which would be very novel, but very interesting if it would become part of our system, is that when the DOJ abuses a statute, or when the court gives what is maybe an erroneous interpretation, instead of waiting years for it to get to the Supreme Court to fix it with the right interpretation, and the Supreme Court, obviously, it takes years and years to get there, millions of dollars and years, but Congress perhaps can try passing resolutions on the floor that speak to the meaning of the laws that it passed. And that way, if we had a system like that, then the elected officials can begin to take an active role in interpreting these statutes. So if the Justice Department says that 1512 can apply to a person who is a misdemeanor, Congress can get on the floor, pass a resolution with maybe even 13, 14 members, and say, we say that the statute should be defined this way. We're the ones who we believe that this is what we intended. So I don't know if that would be conclusive, but it would definitely be something new in our system where instead of unelected federal judges making those decisions, it would go back to the people. There are lots of other ideas, and there are lots of attorneys and others who definitely would like to open up this discussion. And this, as I said, this is not unique to January 6th. This affects all Americans. And I want to conclude by saying, in my opinion, though, and we appreciate every single thing that you do, everybody who came here today, but we cannot legislate our way out of this. Justice will only be restored to our nation when we turn our eyes to our Father in heaven. So often, when I tell people about the undeniable injustice against January 6ers, they say, well, they shouldn't have been there. How often do we hear that? These people, they don't dispute that January 6ers are being unfairly punished. They're just not bothered by it because it doesn't affect them yet. They've forgotten the famous poem by Pastor Martin Niemöller. First, they came for one group, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't one of them. Then they came out for another group, and I didn't speak out because I was not one of them. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out. In the book of Genesis, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery because of envy, anger, and hatred. Years later in Egypt, they found themselves imprisoned, and they said to one another, quote, "We are guilty because we witnessed the suffering of our brother when he pleaded with us, and we did not hear him. That is why this suffering has come upon us." The injustice of January 6th, I've seen it firsthand in the courtroom, looking at the juries. It's fueled by envy, anger, and hatred, and it can be stopped only with repentance, prayer, and kindness. God only asks that we seek him and that we are our brother's keepers. If we do what he asks, he will end this madness. So I thank you all for providing us with this opportunity, and I only ask that you use your platforms as elected officials to direct the eyes of this great nation to our Father in heaven, and pray that he unifies our hearts to love and fear his name, and that he who makes peace in the heavens should make peace